23-year-old arrives at the ER. Now, by all accounts, they're healthy. But now they're combative. They're hallucinating. They are massively dehydrated. So I guess not that healthy. The medical team runs a routine toxicological screen, the standard panel that checks for common drugs of abuse, and it comes back negatives. Apparently, this isn't drugs, but it sure as looks like drugs, doesn't it? Hours pass, and the patient's condition deteriorates. New lab results reveal something pretty alarming. Rhabdomyolysis, that's muscle tissue breaking down so rapidly that it's poisoning the patient's kidneys, and acute kidney stress follows that. The body is essentially attacking itself from the inside. Now, eventually, the truth emerges. The patient had taken drugs. They'd taken something called Foxy. This is a substance that slipped right through the hospital's detection systems, and here's what makes this case rather unsettling. Standard toxicological screens, the ones that emergency departments rely on every single day when they suspect drugs, they often can't detect something called hallucinogenic tryptamines. These are compounds that operate in the kind of blind spot of modern medical testing. And that raises an important question. If our best medical tests can't see this, how many cases are we actually missing? How many unexplained psychotic episodes, mysterious organ failures, and even deaths might be traced back to a substance that tox screens simply can't detect? Well, today we're going to cover the story of something called Foxy Methoxy. It's a drug that is so elusive that even when it's killing you, hospitals might not even know that it's there. Alright, so let's start simple, or as simple as it gets when talking about chemistry things, which I swear to God have impossible to pronounce names. What exactly is Foxy Methoxy? The chemical name is 5-MeO-DIPD, or if you want the full mouthful, which I don't, but I'm going to attempt, you're so welcome, 5-methoxy-N-N-disopropyltramine. I know that's not right, but it's just... It's like 2 lines long. It's a synthetic tryptamine psychedelic, meaning it's lab-made, it's not found in nature, and it belongs to the same chemical family as DMT and psilocybin, which sounds fun. But here's where things get dangerous. We're talking about doses measured in milligrams here, typically between 6 and 20 milligrams, according to the literature. Now, to put that in perspective, that's roughly the weight of a single grain of salt. The margin between a recreational dose and a toxic one is barely there. Users have taken it orally, they've snorted it, they've occasionally smoked it. We sure are creative, aren't we? When taken by mouth, which is the most common route, onset happens about 20 to 30 minutes later. The peak hits at about an hour to an hour and a half in. Total duration, somewhere between 3 and 6 hours. Remember those numbers, 20 to 30 minutes before you feel it. And that delay becomes crucial to understanding why this drug has sent so many people to the hospital. When you don't feel the effects of what you're taking immediately, what do you think people do? Well, it's go time. They take more. They want that hit. That's why it's not working. I didn't take enough. And look, with milligram level dosing, that second dose can be the difference between a trip and a trip to the emergency room. Foxy Methoxy traces its origins back to Alexander Shulgin, the legendary psychedelic chemist who documented hundreds of compounds in his books Fecal and Tecal. 5-MeO-DIPD appears in Tecal, which, by the way, stands for Tryptamines I Have Known and Loved, published in 1997. Chemist. Explorer. But Shulgin's academic exploration would soon escape the laboratory. Academic exploration. Now, by the late 1990s, we entered what's known as the research chemical era. Entrepreneurs realized that they could synthesize Shulgin's formulas and sell them online in the sort of legal gray area. These compounds were not explicitly illegal yet because lawmakers hadn't heard of them, so they couldn't make them illegal. Between 1999 and 2003, something shifted. Law enforcement, they started logging encounters. Poison control centers started receiving calls. Foxy wasn't just a curiosity in chemistry forums anymore, it was on the street. Online vendors marketed alongside other exotic tryptamines, shipping it worldwide with just a few clicks. Isn't the internet incredible even 20 years ago? Then came a particularly insidious development. Foxy began appearing in tablet and capsule form at raves and clubs, sometimes pressed with the same logos as MDMA pills. Spiders, alien heads, you know the drill. Imagine thinking you're taking ecstasy, but instead you're ingesting a completely different psychedelic with a completely different risk profile. Not exactly brilliant. And this confusion was instant and dangerous. Clubgoers who were expecting the warmth of MDMA instead found themselves in an intense psychedelic experience that they absolutely were not prepared for. Emergency rooms started seeing patients who didn't even know what they'd taken. Okay, So it wasn't all accidental. Some people absolutely did seek out this drug. But why? Well, according to clinical reports and forensic summaries from agencies tracking the drug, users were tracing a rather specific set of effects. The primary draws were euphoria and disinhibition, that loss of social anxiety that many seek from party drugs. Users reported altered sensory perception with visual and auditory distortions that could range from subtle enhancements to full-blown hallucinations. Many became talkative, experiencing what they described as emotional enhancement. Colors seemed brighter, music more profound, conversations more meaningful. At higher doses, users reported abstract, closed-eye imagery, complex geometric patterns, and dreamlike visions when they shut their eyes. Early internet forums and archives from the period also reveal another selling point. Foxy developed a reputation as an erotic enhancer. Users claimed it intensified physical sensations and emotional connections during intimate encounters. So, yeah, fair to say the drug found a user base, didn't it? The promise was a unique psychedelic experience that combined the social lubricant effects of MDMA with the perceptual alterations of traditional hallucinogens. Don't want to say it, but it sounds kind of fun. I know it's this channel. I know, but this doesn't sound bad. I know it's dangerous, but this sounds kind of nice. Sorry, if you can't tell from my voice, I'm also not feeling very well. I'm on one today. For a certain subset of drug users, that combination was exactly what they were looking for. But the human body often has other plans. Even when users got the experience they wanted, it frequently came with a physical price that clinical reports document in stark detail. Gastrointestinal disease was common. Nausea, vomiting, abdominal cramping. Users developed mydriasis. Pupils dilated so wide that bright lights became painful. Hearts raced with tachycardia. Muscles locked up with tension that could last hours. And for many, instead of euphoria, they found themselves consumed by agitation and anxiety. That sounds less fun. The data from poison control centers in the early 2000s tells a sobering story. They logged dozens of exposures, and here's what stands out. An unusually high proportion resulted in what they classify as moderate or major effects. And we're not talking about bad trips that resolve with time and reassurance here. We're talking about medical emergencies requiring intensive intervention. Again, sounding less fun. Think about that for a moment. The active dose fits on the head of a pin. It's just a few milligrams of powder, but the consequences could land you in the intensive care unit where you'll be fighting for your life. The body's reaction to this tiny amount of chemical could be catastrophic, and poison control data showed that this wasn't a rare occurrence. It was a pattern. The toxic potential of Foxy Methoxy wasn't some outlier or urban legend. It was documented, quantified, and alarming enough that medical professionals were sounding alarms for years before it was banned. So let's move from statistics to specific cases, shall we? Real people whose encounters with Foxy Methoxy ended up in medical journals. Well, in 2006, the Mayo Clinic published a study that should have served as a warning to just about everybody. A patient arrived after ingesting what they reported as a single dose of Foxy. What followed was a cascade of organ failure. Rhabdomyolysis set in. That's those muscle fibers breaking down en masse, flooding the bloodstream with proteins that the kidneys couldn't handle. This led directly to transient acute renal failure. The patient's kidneys essentially shut down, unable to filter the cellular debris overwhelming their system. One dose of Foxy nearly destroyed this person's kidneys. But it gets worse. Also from 2006, there's a document of fatality directly attributed to the drug. Post-mortem analysis confirmed the presence of both the parent compound and its metabolites in the victim's system. The cause of death? Acute cardiac failure due to neurotoxicity. In simpler terms, the drug poisoned the nervous system so severely that the heart just stopped working. This is not an urban legend passed around on drug forums. This is peer-reviewed, published medical literature. Now, understanding why Foxy became so dangerous requires looking beyond just the chemical itself. The real danger emerged from how it was actually used in the real world. First, the milligram dosing. When you're dealing with amounts this small, eyeballing it isn't just risky, it is potentially lethal. Most users don't have precision scales. Can't imagine someone whipping those out in a club to measure out their drugs. Then there's that delayed onset we mentioned, 20 to 30 minutes before things kick in. In a party environment, that half hour could feel like forever. Users would convince themselves that the first dose was weak or fake, so they'd take some more. By the time the first dose kicked in, they'd already swallowed a second or a third, setting themselves up for a potentially fatal overdose. The mislabeling problem made everything much worse. Do you remember those MDMA-style logos pressed into tablets? Well, people thought they were taking ecstasy at a familiar dose, not realizing they'd consumed something requiring completely different dosing conditions. And perhaps more critically, when things went wrong, emergency rooms couldn't detect it. Standard tox screens came back negative while patients deteriorated. Doctors were forced to treat symptoms blindly, losing precious time that could mean the difference between recovery and permanent organ damage. So the evidence really was mounting. Poison control calls, emergency room admissions, organ failures, and now there were deaths. And the question became inevitable. What were regulators going to do now that they were recognizing the pattern? But first, before we get into that, we need to talk about the science. We should understand why Foxy Methoxy does what it does, both the desired effects and the devastating consequences. So we need to look at how it interacts with the brain. 5-MeO-DIPT is what's called a serotonogenic psychedelic. Basically, it works by binding to serotonin receptors in your brain, specifically the same receptor targeted by LSD, psilocybin, and DMT. It's essentially the brain's hallucinogen switch. Foxy binds to these receptors. It triggers the cascade of perceptual changes users experience, the visual distortions, the altered sense of reality, the emotional intensity. But Foxy doesn't stop there. Research shows it also activates other receptors and interacts with something called SERT, the serotonin transporter. Animal studies revealed some disturbing effects. Lab animals, given the drug, could barely move. They also got hypothermia, their body temperature dropping dangerously. So, you see, the drug is pulling multiple levers in one of your brain's most crucial neurotransmitter systems, the one that regulates mood, body temperature, perception, and basic physiological functions. Those are important. And as we've seen, when you start mixing chemicals that affect serotonin, that can be a problem. So what we're about to discuss is based on inference from closely related compounds, not direct studies of Foxy itself, but the implications are serious enough that they do need to be addressed. While we don't have well-documented cases of Foxy, we have extensive data on its chemical cousins. 5-MeO-DMT, which shares that critical 5-MeO structure, has been shown to cause dangerous, even life-threatening reactions when combined with MAOIs like harmaline. The pattern is consistent and terrifying. When these related tryptamines are combined with MAOIs, users develop severe hyperthermia. That's body temperature skyrocketing to dangerous levels. Heat so intense it can cause seizures, organ failure, it can even kill you. Given that 5-MeO-DIPT works through the same serotonin systems, the risk of similar interactions is entirely plausible. Combine Foxy with an MAOI, or even with multiple other serotonogenic drugs like MDMA, SSRIs, or even certain over-the-counter medications, and you're potentially setting up the conditions for serotonin syndrome. Now, serotonin syndrome is what happens when your serotonin system goes into overdrive: confusion, agitation, rapid heart rate, dilated pupils, muscle rigidity, heavy sweating, diarrhea, headaches, shivering, and in severe cases, high fever, seizures, irregular heartbeat, unconsciousness, and death. Now, to be clear, this is a risk principle based on the drug's known mechanisms and the behavior of similar compounds, not a claim that this combination has been extensively documented with Foxy specifically. But when you're dealing with a drug that's already shown it can cause organ failure and death on its own, the possibility of fatal interactions isn't something to gamble with. The serotonin system simply isn't meant to be pushed this hard from multiple directions. Alright, so by 2003, the federal government, they're definitely seen enough of this shit. The DEA moved to emergency schedule 5-MeO-DIPT, placing temporary controls on the substance while they built their case for permanent prohibition. This wasn't a knee-jerk reaction. Emergency scheduling requires demonstrating an imminent threat to public safety. On September the 29th, 2004, the hammer came down permanently. 5-MeO-DIPT was placed in Schedule 1, the most restrictive category under the Controlled Substances Act. This put Foxy in the same legal category as heroin and LSD, substances the government considers to have the highest potential for abuse and no accepted medical value. Fun fact here, by the way, heroin is a prescription drug in the UK for severe pain. The more you know. The DEA's reasoning was straightforward. Damning. First, no accepted medical use. This wasn't a pharmaceutical that had been diverted, it was a purely recreational drug. Second, high potential for abuse. The poison control data in emergency room reports, they spoke for themselves. Manufacturing became a serious federal crime. Distribution carries mandatory minimum sentences. Even possession for personal use is a crime. When a substance hits Schedule 1, the street supply doesn't just trickle away, it collapses. And the data proves exactly that with Foxy. The DEA's own numbers from their 2024 evaluation sheet tell a remarkable story of a drug's rise and complete disappearance. Since tracking began in 1999, forensic labs have identified 5-MeO-DIPT in 6,237 total reports. But look at the pattern. After scheduling, reports actually surged in 2011, likely as the early 20s research chemical wave hit its peak and existing stockpiles circulated. Dealers and users were moving what supply remained, possibly not even knowing that it had been banned. But then came the collapse. By 2022, forensic labs across the entire United States encountered Foxy in just 4 cases. In 2023, 1 single report. Think about what that means. In a country of 330 million people with thousands of drug seizures happening every day, this supposedly dangerous hallucinogen appeared exactly once in an entire year of forensic testing. And this answers our opening question. Why haven't you heard of Foxy Methoxy? Well, because it's essentially extinct. It's not hiding in the shadows of the drug market, it just seems to be gone. Schedule 1 classification, combined with its reputation for unpredictable toxicity, accomplished what drug enforcement rarely achieves, a near total elimination of a substance from the illicit market. Now, the United States wasn't alone in recognizing the threat. Multiple countries moved to control 5-MeO-DIPT, each taking their own approach to the problem. The UK took a particularly interesting route. Rather than scheduling drugs one by one as they appeared, British authorities adopted generic tryptamine controls between 2014 and 2015. The Advisory Council on the Misuse of Drugs recommended, and the Home Office implemented, sweeping changes that captured entire families of chemicals based on their structural definitions. This placed a wide group of substitute tryptamines, including 5-MeO-DIPT, under Class A. That's the UK's most serious drug category, equivalent to heroin and cocaine. This structural approach was pretty clever. Instead of playing whack-a-mole with each new compound, they essentially banned the entire chemical family tree. If it looked like tryptamine and it had certain modifications, it was still illegal. Period. No clever games. Other nations implemented their own controls, each reflecting their particular legal frameworks and public health philosophies. The important point for anyone watching this is drug laws evolve, and they vary dramatically by jurisdiction. What's legal in one country might carry a life sentence in another. The global patchwork of drug legalization means that Foxy's legal status, it just depends on where you're standing when you ask the question. So now we should clear up some critical confusion, because in the early 2000s drug scene, similar sounding names led to some pretty dangerous mix-ups. 5-MeO-DIPT, Foxy Methoxy, is not the same as 2CT7, which was sometimes called Blue Mystic. Despite both being psychedelics, popular in the same era, they are completely different chemicals with completely different effects, durations, and risk profiles. 2CT7 is a phenethylamine, not a tryptamine. Taking one thinking it's the other could have serious consequences. Even more important is distinguishing Foxy from 5-MeO-DMT, and yes, they both share the 5-MeO prefix, and yes, they're both tryptamines, but that is where the similarities end. 5-MeO-DMT is dramatically more potent and incredibly short-acting. We're talking about an experience that's measured in minutes here, not hours. Users expecting Foxy's 3 to 6 hour journey, who got 5-MeO-DMT instead, would find themselves in an overwhelmingly intense experience that they had not prepared for. The early 2000s scene was rife with this confusion. Online vendors sometimes mislabeled products. Street dealers often didn't know what they were even selling. Press coverage conflated different substances. Forum posts mixed up trip reports. Each of these compounds has its own dosage range, its own duration, and its own potential for harm. In a world where a few milligrams can mean the difference between life and death, not exactly brilliant, is it? And this confusion wasn't just academic. Emergency room doctors trying to save someone's life needed to know exactly what they were dealing with. Treatment protocols that might work for one substance could be useless or even harmful for another. The similar names and overlapping user communities created a perfect storm of misidentification that made an already dangerous situation even worse. Today, Foxy Methoxy is essentially extinct in the drug supply, but essentially isn't the same as completely, is it? Legacy powders sitting in someone's drawer for 2 decades, mislabeled tablets in old collections, dead stock from dealers who went underground. These remnants, they could still exist. They could still be out there. And here's where we should close the loop from the opening of today's story. If someone takes Foxy today and ends up in an emergency room, they face the same problem that existed 20 years ago. Routine toxicology screens still won't detect it. Standard panels haven't been updated to include obscure tryptamines that barely exist anymore. Clinicians treating a patient today would rely on the same imperfect tools, the patient's history if they're coherent enough to provide it, expensive targeted assays if the hospital even has them, and symptom management while hoping they've guessed right about what they're dealing with. So how did a milligram range research chemical called Foxy Methoxy go from underground party enhancer to Schedule 1 drug linked to organ failure and death and then completely vanish? Well, it flourished briefly in that grey zone between chemistry and commerce, where the internet first enabled direct-to-consumer drug distribution. For a few years, it rode the wave of the research chemical era, marketed as a legal alternative to established psychedelics. But the body count mounted. The case reports accumulated. Emergency rooms struggled with undetectable overdoses. At least one person died. The DEA moved decisively, placing it in Schedule 1 in 2004. And then, remarkably, it actually disappeared. Unlike most banned drugs that simply move deeper underground, Foxy Methoxy essentially vanished. It remains a reminder of that brief moment when anyone could order exotic psychedelics online and the very real human cost of treating powerful chemicals as casual experiments. Thank you for watching.